"Sir, I don't care what you used to be. This room is for board members only. You'll need to wait outside." The words hit harder than a closed door. They were spoken with the sharp efficiency of someone too young to understand the damage they could do, but old enough to enjoy delivering it. The speaker, Amanda Crowley, was the executive assistant to the CEO of Hallberg Logistics, a rising star in the corporate world. Her posture said power. Her eyes said dismissal. She stood at the doorway of Conference Room A like a gatekeeper to some sacred space, guarding it from uninvited relics of the past. And Clarence Myles? He just stood there. He was 76, wearing a suit that had been brushed and pressed the night before with deliberate care. It wasn't new, but it was clean. His shoes were shined. His posture was straight, if slightly stiff from the pain that never left his left side since a mortar shell took out the Jeep beside his in 1971. In one hand, he held a manila folder. In the other, a simple cane polished smooth from decades of use. His name was on the invitation. He had read it 3 times that morning, even called the number to confirm he was welcome. "You were recommended for our Legacy Round Table, Colonel," the voice on the other end had said. "We'd be honored to have you." But standing here, facing the expression on Amanda Crowley's face, you'd never have guessed it. "I was invited," Clarence said, with quiet firmness. "Name's right there on your list. Clarence Myles." Amanda didn't even glance. "I don't care if your name is on the moon. This meeting is for current board members. You're not one of them." Behind her, through the glass, Clarence could see a dozen executives seated around a gleaming oak table. Suits, tablets, bottles of imported water. They didn't look up. Or maybe they did and chose to look past him. One man leaned toward another and whispered something that made them both smirk. A third checked his phone. Clarence took a step back. Not because she told him to, but because he recognized this moment. It wasn't new. It was older than his bones. The moment when a room full of people decided they'd already measured your worth based on how long you paused before opening the door. He had faced more dangerous thresholds in his life. Bamboo jungles, battlefield radios crackling with distress calls, helicopters hovering under gunfire. But none of those places had dismissed him so efficiently, so coldly. He sat on a bench outside the room. The hallway was white tile, silent and drafty. He folded his invitation carefully and slid it back into his pocket. Then he rested both hands on his cane and stared ahead at the wall opposite him, painted corporate blue, like it could pretend to have a heart. He waited, not out of passivity, out of principle. 40 minutes passed. The meeting inside droned on. Clarence could hear snippets through the glass. Quarterlies are up, realignment, cut costs in the legacy division. Legacy. They kept using that word. They just didn't mean him. He didn't check the time, didn't sigh, didn't complain. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook, leather-bound, worn edges, the kind issued in 1968 when he was stationed in Pleiku. Inside, sketches of supply routes, hand-drawn field maps, codes, frequencies, a quote written in pen beneath the cover flap. "Lead quietly, serve completely, be forgotten with dignity." He had lived by it. Until now. Down the hall, 2 junior analysts watched him in silence. "Who's that guy?" one of them whispered. "No idea. Probably maintenance or something." Then the elevator dinged, and the air changed. The kind of change you don't hear, you feel, like pressure dropping before a storm. A woman in her 60s stepped out. Short gray hair, no makeup, combat boots, a tailored blazer. Her gait was direct, her expression unreadable. She moved like a general even in retirement, because she was one. Retired Major General Ava Kincaid. Her face was known in every branch. Her citations filled pages. Her legacy was undeniable. She walked past the front desk, past the receptionist that stammered a greeting, past the marble wall etched with the corporate motto, "Progress through Honor." She locked eyes on Clarence and stopped. "Colonel Myles," she asked, voice steady. Clarence looked up. "General." "You, out," she said, pointing at Amanda. "Excuse me?" she blinked. "I said out. You're dismissed, permanently, if I have anything to say about it." Amanda stumbled backward. General Kincaid stepped aside. "Colonel Myles, you've waited long enough. Come in. Take your seat. Head of the table." And when Clarence stood, the hallway fell silent. Not because they understood yet, but because someone had reminded them what leadership looks like. "He's just here for the free coffee, you know." The sentence drifted from behind a glass partition in the hallway, quiet enough to be called a whisper, loud enough to wound. Clarence Myles heard it, and like every other insult he'd absorbed since retiring from active duty, he folded it into that quiet place inside himself where soldiers store pain they don't have time to show. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn. But General Ava Kincaid did. She was standing beside him now, having escorted him into Conference Room A only minutes ago, pausing the meeting, introducing him to a room of startled executives and pulling out the chair at the head of the table for him with deliberate ceremony. Now they sat side by side, a decorated colonel and a general who'd refused to forget. Across the conference table, the members of the Legacy Round Table looked everywhere but at Clarence. Their smiles were tight, their bodies stiff. Only one man, Martin Kessler, mid-40s, CFO, mustered a polite nod. "Would you like anything before we begin, Colonel?" he asked. Clarence gave a soft shake of his head. "No, thank you. I brought what I need." He tapped the worn notebook resting in front of him, the one filled with the names of fallen soldiers, handwritten coordinates and field diagrams, pages filled not with theory, but with survival. General Kincaid cleared her throat. "Before we start throwing around projections and graphs, I'd like to say something." The room shifted nervously. "Every one of you is sitting here today," she said, scanning their faces, "because of people like Colonel Myles. Not in theory, in truth, in action. The networks he built in Southeast Asia, under mortar fire, with no backup, became the foundation for our modern logistics command systems." She turned slightly. "Clarence, tell them what you carried on your back." He hesitated. Then, in a low voice, he said, "TRC-75 backpack radio, antenna, 4 spare batteries, 3 encrypted maps, signal flares, 2 morphine injectors I never used on myself, and a rifle." "And how much did that weigh?" she asked. Clarence looked down, then up again. 72 pounds. Not counting the wet." A beat passed. The room was silent. Then came a voice from the corner. "Yeah, but that was a long time ago," a man muttered. "Jason Luce, VP of Domestic Development. Tan suit, flashy watch. No offense, General, but what's that got to do with running modern logistics in 2025? The question hung in the air like a challenge no one wanted to touch. Clarence leaned forward, hands resting on the edge of the table. "Do you know what the biggest risk in battlefield communications is, Mr. Luce?" No. "In assuming your message went through just because you spoke it." The room went still. Clarence continued. "You can build the best systems in the world, fastest satellites, smartest software. But if the people running it don't know what it feels like to wait in silence for confirmation, You're not leading, you're guessing." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Outside the room, Amanda Crawley was being quietly ushered out by security, per General Kincaid's instruction. She tried to protest, tried to defend her earlier treatment of Clarence, but the building's HR director, a woman named Elise Santiago, simply showed her the internal email marked confidential that Ava had forwarded moments earlier. Attached to it, a photo of Clarence's Silver Star citation, a commendation letter from General Colin Powell, and a scanned memo signed by President Jimmy Carter. Amanda stopped protesting after that. Back in Conference Room A, something shifted. It was slow at first, like the turning of a ship, but real. Questions began. Clarence answered every one, not with ego, not with rank, but with stories that bled insight. When asked about operational efficiency, he told them about routing field rations through jungle roads when GPS didn't exist. When asked about risk management, he described maintaining signal flow while carrying a wounded private uphill under fire. And when asked about retirement, he said, "I didn't retire. I repositioned. The mission just changed." By the end of the meeting, half the room was taking notes. As the group stood for coffee and a break, Clarence moved to the back of the room. There was a table with pastries and cups. He poured himself some black coffee, no sugar, just the way he always drank it. Martin Kessler approached him quietly. "Sir, I owe you an apology." Clarence raised an eyebrow. "I laughed when you walked in. Thought you were someone's driver or a maintenance guy. That's on me." Clarence nodded. "I was maintenance. For morale, for survival, for entire platoons." Martin looked down, ashamed. "That's not what I meant. I know. But you'll remember it now. That's what matters." As the break ended, Ava Kincaid called everyone back. "We've got one last thing before we adjourn," she said. "There's a vote." Some heads tilted. No one had mentioned a vote. She tapped the tablet in front of her. "Effective immediately, I'm proposing the addition of Colonel Clarence Myles to the advisory board of Halberg Logistics with full voting rights and legacy compensation." Gasps. Jason Luce scoffed. "This isn't protocol." "No," Ava said. "It's correction." Then she looked around. "All in favor?" Hands rose slowly, then more, until only Jason's remained down. Clarence turned to him. "You don't have to agree with my presence, son, but you'll have to sit with it." And with that, the vote passed. That afternoon, when the hallway cleared and the board had left, Clarence sat alone in the room again. Not excluded, not dismissed, but present, officially. He looked at the empty chair beside him and smiled. "They thought I came for the free coffee, but I stayed for the legacy," he whispered to himself. The conference room fell into an uneasy silence. The same silence that follows a sudden crack of thunder, unnatural, expectant. "You brought him back for what?" someone finally asked, the words soaked in confusion and veiled insult. It was Mr. Collier, Martin Collier, Vice President of Strategic Partnerships. His cufflinks shimmered in the morning light as he leaned forward on the polished oak table, voice low and bitter. "I fail to see the value of inviting someone who left this company 30 years ago under contentious circumstances to sit in on board-level discussions." Clarence Myles sat at the far end of the table, hands folded calmly, eyes fixed not on Collier, but on a map of Halberg's expansion projects displayed on the wall. He didn't answer. Not yet. General Ava Kincaid, seated beside him, turned her gaze toward Collier slowly, like a storm cloud forming just over the horizon. I brought him back because this company stands on ground it doesn't even remember laying. Collier scoffed. We've built ourselves on merit, growth, numbers. Military nostalgia is not a business strategy. Clarence finally spoke, not loudly, but with the kind of voice you had to lean in to hear, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command a room. Is that why there's a radio tower in northern Samar still bearing the Hallberg emblem that I built with local parts after the company's equipment failed in the storm? Collier blinked. That tower, Clarence continued, still feeds half the emergency traffic for coastal recovery operations. Your quarterly report didn't include it, but it's still running, on power I wired in from a floodlight system. He paused, let the room absorb it. I did that on my own time, with no overtime pay, no acknowledgement, because I believed in what we were building. The words didn't just land, they cracked. Across the table, Gregor Hahn leaned forward. I looked into it. There are several unregistered field solutions attributed to third-party contractors in our archives, but most of them trace back to Clarence. They just scrubbed the names. Which raises the question, Ava added coldly. Who authorized the scrubbing? No one answered. Clarence stood slowly. I'm not here for a parade. I'm here because someone asked what's missing from the next-gen rollout, and I told her signal integrity, not the tech, the people. He walked to the map, pointed to a red zone. There's no cultural liaisons in these districts, no military redundancy protocol in your supply schematics. You've built a grid without understanding the terrain. That's not strategy. That's arrogance. Then he pointed to another area. And here, your delay in deployment has nothing to do with bandwidth. It's because the local unit has no trust in your support team. They've been burned before. I know, because I trained 2 of them. He turned back to the table. I came to help, not to be liked. Later that afternoon, Clarence stepped outside to clear his head. The boardroom was still buzzing with side conversations and sudden task forces being formed. But he needed air, quiet. He sat on a bench overlooking the Hallberg courtyard, a serene landscaped stretch with a fountain and benches named after past board chairs. He looked at each one. None of them bore his name. He wasn't surprised. He was still watching the water ripple when Gregor joined him, holding 2 paper cups of coffee. 1 sugar, no cream, right? Clarence nodded, accepting the cup. Gregor sat. They don't know what to do with you, he said after a moment. Clarence raised an eyebrow. You don't fit into their boxes, Gregor continued. You're not a threat. You're not a politician. You don't want stock options or a job title. You just want the machine to work right. Clarence sipped the coffee. That's what it was always about. Inside, the tone had shifted. General Kincaid stood at the front of the room with a single folder in her hand, labeled Project Ghostwire, 1989 to 1994. This file contains field reports, recovered logs, and command-level briefings, all of which reference critical systems engineered and sustained by one Clarence Myles. Not one of them made it into your formal legacy documents. Collier frowned. Where did you get that? It was declassified this morning, she said, at my request, through the Department of Defense. She held up the file. And so are you now. You're going to read it. All of you. Back at the bench, Clarence leaned back, watching the sunlight shift across the courtyard bricks. Gregor looked over. Do you regret it, coming back? Clarence took a moment. "No, but I regret what they forgot." "You mean what they erased?" Clarence's jaw tightened. "I mean what they never even tried to remember." That night, a draft memo circulated through Halberg's senior communications department. Subject: Historical Corrections Initiative. Proposal: Launch of Legacy Restored Project. Objective: Identify, document, and reintegrate contributions by past employees whose fieldwork was foundational but uncredited. The memo had no official author name at the top, but the footer carried a single phrase: "No voice unheard, no signal lost. C.M." The following morning, the building felt different. Not visibly. No signs had changed, no murals repainted, and the same polished floor gleamed in the executive wing. But something intangible had shifted, like the static in the air before a thunderstorm. Clarence Myles arrived just after 7 a.m. He had a habit of showing up early, an old habit from radio duty. You arrived before the transmission started, or you missed the message entirely. Gregor was already in the lobby, waiting. "They're meeting about you again," he said quietly. "Executive committee, closed-door session." Clarence raised an eyebrow, but didn't reply. Gregor hesitated. "They're talking about how to spin it, not the truth, the narrative. There's a difference now." Clarence nodded slowly. "Then it's time we reminded them." Upstairs, in Conference Room A, the board members sat in a tight semicircle. Martin Collier was pacing, gesturing with his tablet like it was a gavel. "We can't just admit we forgot him. There are liability implications, PR consequences, questions we can't afford." Across the room, Ava Kincaid stood at the far wall, arms crossed. She hadn't said a word in 10 minutes, just listened, watched. "We can't just admit we forgot him. There are liability implications, PR consequences, questions we can't afford." "Are you hearing yourself?" Ava finally said. Her voice wasn't raised, but it struck like iron. "You're worried about truth because it's inconvenient, not because it's wrong." Collier turned to her. "I'm worried about survival." "No, you're worried about your seat at this table. That's different." Then she walked to the far wall of the boardroom where a massive glass mural hung, etched with the names of Halberg's founding contributors. It spanned from floor to ceiling, gleaming, perfect, except it was a lie. Clarence Myles's name wasn't on it. Neither were the names of a dozen field engineers who'd served in Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, men and women who'd built the signal networks that Halberg had monetized for decades. Not one. Ava looked at the mural for a long moment. Then she turned around. "If we don't fix this, we lose every veteran contractor on the Eastern Circuit. We lose faith from field ops, and we lose the very people this company once relied on to survive storms and bullets." She tapped the glass. "You want damage control? Here it is. Erase the wall, or we erase the trust." That same afternoon, Clarence walked the corridors of Halberg with Gregor. They passed interns, managers, CAC engineers, people nodding now, respectfully. Some whispered his name. Some didn't know what to say, but their eyes said enough. At the end of the hall was the Heritage Room. Gregor stopped. "This is it." Inside were the archives, the company's official record, public and private. They entered together. Boxes of old field reports lined the shelves, photos, letters, communications logs written in hand, punched on typewriters, scratched in pencil on waterproof paper. Clarence moved slowly, reverently. In the far corner was a display, Pioneers of Progress. It featured several framed portraits. One caught his eye. It was his, younger, still in uniform, holding a field mic with a portable receiver strapped to his back. He turned to Gregor. "I didn't know this was here." Gregor looked down. It wasn't. Ava had it restored last night, quietly. She said no one needed a press release, just a reckoning. Clarence's gaze lingered on the photo. "They called me a ghost operator back then. Never on the payroll, never in the newsletters, but the signals always came through." Gregor's voice was low. "No more ghosts, Clarence." 2 days later, Halberg held a rare full-company town hall, not on Zoom, not through memos, in person. Over 600 employees packed into the company auditorium. Clarence stood backstage, hesitant. Ava stepped beside him. "You don't have to speak, I know. But they need to hear it, I know." And then he walked out into the light. The applause wasn't loud. It was slow, growing, rising like a wave that couldn't be held back. Clarence stepped up to the mic. "You probably don't know me. I worked for Halberg before your badge scanners did, before email, before the internet." A small chuckle rippled through the crowd. "I was a field operator. I didn't wear a suit. I didn't sit at desks. I carried wires through rivers and dug antennas out of clay." He paused. "And for 30 years, no one mentioned my name." Silence. "But I'm here to say something simpler. I never worked for recognition. I worked so your signal would never fail, so your calls would never drop, so your messages would reach the people who needed them." He looked across the room. "That still matters. That must still matter. Because if we forget the people who built the path, we'll never know when we've left it." He stepped back. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was sacred. Back in the Heritage Room, that glass wall was quietly dismantled, not with ceremony, not with camera crews. Just a note on the door. "Temporarily removed for truth calibration." By weekend, a new wall was in place, smaller, but etched with hundreds of names recovered from old files. At the top, in bold letters, "No voice unheard." Clarence's name was the first, but it wasn't in gold. It was in bronze, stronger, older, lasting. The ribbon was navy blue, deep, ceremonial, folded twice at the edge like a flag. Clarence Myles stood before it, dressed in a simple charcoal gray suit. No medals, no pins, just a pocket square tucked neat and square, and a weather expression that held more than any plaque ever could. Around him, a crowd gathered, not executives in tailored suits alone, but technicians in oil-stained boots, former field operatives, interns, and veterans. Even Ava Kincaid was there, not in her usual black blazer, but in a muted green jacket with a small Vietnam service pin fastened near the collar. Clarence didn't speak right away. He let the breeze settle, let the sun cut through the clouds and rest, quiet and unassuming, on the newly unveiled sign. The Clarence Myles Center for Field Innovation, dedicated to every unseen, unheard, but never unneeded voice. There was no applause, only silence, and in that silence, dignity. It had been 3 months since that boardroom meeting, since the mural came down, since the Legacy Restored project became more than an apology, it became a mission. The new center wasn't flashy, no glass ceilings or glossy entrances. It was built on the south side of the Halberg campus, where sunlight lingered longer in the late afternoon and wildflowers sometimes creeped through the gravel. Inside, it housed the archives Clarence had once walked through with Gregor. But it also became more. A living lab for signal technology, named after a man who never filed a patent, but whose techniques were still used on military forward bases. A mentorship hub for young veterans entering engineering careers. A digital memorial wall for field operators with no LinkedIn profiles, no mentions in company press, but whose voices carried through radio static in jungles, deserts, and oceans. And right at the center of the main lobby, embedded in the concrete beneath the welcome desk, were 5 words chiseled clean and sharp. No voice unheard ever again. Clarence hadn't asked for any of this. When Ava first brought him the blueprints, he hesitated. "I don't need a building," he said. "No," she replied, "but others need a place to remember you stood here." Clarence folded the papers quietly, then looked out the window for a long time before answering. "Then don't build it for me," he said. "Build it for the ones still in the field who think silence is all they'll ever get back." A week after the center opened, an email arrived at Clarence's personal address. The sender's name was unfamiliar, but the subject line read, "My father served with you." He clicked it open. "Dear Mr. Myles, I found your name in an article about the new center. My father, Benjamin Ruiz, was with you in Unit 61, Signal Corps. He passed when I was 10. He never talked much about the war. But he had a notebook, a field log, with a phrase written over and over in the margins. Clarence said, 'No voice unheard.' I always wondered what that meant. Now I do. Thank you, sir, for keeping his voice alive when it mattered most. With gratitude, Lucas Ruiz." Clarence read the email twice, then shut his laptop slowly. His eyes stayed on the blank wall across the room for several minutes. Then he stood, walked over to the shelf, and opened his old logbook. Page after page of antenna diagrams, frequencies, battle reports, names, voices. He pulled out a pen, and on the final blank page he wrote, "It was never about the wall. It was about the silence behind it, and the men who stood anyway." The next day, Clarence returned to the center, not as a guest, not for a speech, just to sit. He took his usual seat near the south-facing window and watched as 3 new interns entered the exhibit room. One pointed at his portrait and whispered something. Another snapped a picture of the etched quote on the floor. A young woman approached him quietly, notebook in hand. "Mr. Myles," she said, "I'm working on the internal onboarding materials for veteran hires. They asked me to include something true, something real." He smiled faintly. "What did you write?" "I wrote that respect isn't retro, it's required." Clarence's smile grew. "Good, then it's a start." As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, the building lights came on. Inside the lobby, the wall now displayed rotating slides of real stories, field reports, photos, handwritten signal logs, including Clarence's. Above the main doorway, engraved in steel, "Some heroes don't echo, they anchor." Clarence walked out into the cool air, wind brushing past his face. Gregor waited by the parking lot, leaning on his car with 2 coffees in hand. "1 cream, 1 sugar," he said. Clarence chuckled. "Someone's still paying attention." Gregor handed him the cup. "You know, most people leave behind titles, maybe a corner office. You left behind silence, made it say something." Clarence nodded. "Let's just hope they keep listening." They stood there a moment longer, quiet. Then Clarence said, almost to himself, "We weren't loud, but we were there."